you, Bill. When you sit and listen to an introduction like that, what do? If I were wise, I'd just sit down, thank you very much, because a lot of the things I was going to kind of tell you about, you already know about them. Mr. Chief Justice, members of the Judiciary, members of the Christian Legal Society, I want to thank those of you who are sponsoring this program, and I understand you have it every year. And for some reason, best known to yourselves, you decided on July 21st, 2022, to invite me to speak here for you today. That was a year ahead. And I'm very thankful, I'm very humble. I never would have thought when I grew up on Hercules Street, on Jeff Davis, that I didn't know anything about lawyers or what they did. But I did find out that there were some problems that our people were having. And I'm just delighted that I had enough sense, with a lot of help along the way, to try to do something about it. So I want to thank this group for inviting me. It's good to have my wife, Carol, who we are second marriages. I've been married some over 40 years. She had been married some over 30 years. We met at a church function, and she told me that she wanted to take care of me. And for the last 22 years, she's done that. Thank you very much, Carol. I want to thank Mr. Norman Washington, who lives in Bay Minetta. He is a good friend. I didn't know Mr. Norman Washington, but when I was having some problem about getting here, I just called the one who had been asking me about coming, and he said, don't worry about it. Thank you very much for bringing me, coming up to Tuskegee and coming down. Now, when Mr. Cooper wrote me a letter about a year ago, inviting me to be here today, this is what he told me. He said, we would like for you to speak for about 25 minutes. I've taken about 10 already. On how Jesus Christ has affected your life and your law practice. Most people, when they think about going to a lawyer, they don't think about Jesus Christ. I don't care how good or how bad their case is, they just think about that case. The answer is simple in terms of how Jesus Christ has affected my life and my legal practice is very simple. Jesus Christ's teachings, as set forth in the New Testament, and how Jesus taught his disciples about life and living, as set forth in the New Testament, has controlled not only my law practice, but my entire life. Every aspect of my life, the first thing I think about is what would Jesus want me to do? That's the beginning of it. You've heard about how many siblings I have, so I don't need to tell you about that. But you know, my mother, and she was very religious, and she had these 5 children because one of them died at childbirth. And she told us that we could be anything we wanted to be if we did 3 things. 1, keep Christ first in your life. 2, stay in school and get a good education. And 3, stay out of trouble. Don't get involved in criminal activities, because what's supposed to be a justice equal system doesn't always turn out that way. I tried to do all 3 of those things. And I tried to encourage my children to do the same thing. But in addition to what my mother taught me, those same basic principles were instilled in me, as the others indicated to you, at the Holt Street Church of Christ. That church is still at the corner of Holt and Columbia Avenue. It's at the southern end of the same block where the historic Holt Street Baptist Church, where the Montgomery bus boycott first meeting took place. So then, what happens? What does this have to do with my law practice? It controls it. So when a client enters my office, I don't tell the client this, and explain to me his or her problem. I first ask, what would Jesus Christ want me to do for this crime? Would Jesus want me to obtain for this client what he or she is asking you to do? So that's the first question. If the answer to that is Jesus wouldn't be pleased with it, guess what? That client needs to go and get another lawyer to look at the problem and see whether or not it can be solved. If it passes the Jesus Christ test, and that's the most important of all, then the question is, Fred Gray has some things himself. There are certain basic things that Fred Gray believes in. And so the next question to me is whether or not this client case is one that I feel comfortable that I could in good conscience say, in applying Jesus' test, that it passes my test. And then, if it passes my test, believe it or not, there's another one too. And that other test is, what is the likelihood of success? And when you consider the likelihood of success, you have to then know what the law is. You have to know what the facts are. You have to determine whether or not you will be able to render to this client the services that he or she is entitled to. Once you pass all those tests, the Jesus Christ test, the Fred Gray test, and I realized when I decided riding segregated buses in Montgomery when I came back from Nashville after learning a little something about preaching, about the problems that we were having, I concluded we had some very, very serious problems. And the question is, and on every case, since Claudette Colvin's case, and Claudette Colvin was a 15-year-old girl who on March the 2nd, 1955, did the same thing that Rosa Parks did, but did it 9 months before, without any prodding, without anybody encouraging her to do it, but she had been studying in Black History Month in February, and they were talking about the constitutional rights that African Americans had. And this particular day in Claudette's case, and I'll tell you about her case, because it was the first civil rights case I had. They got out of school a little early at Booker, Washington. They lived up in King Hill, the northeast part of Montgomery. And these kids would take the bus from King Hill downtown, then take Oak Park bus and go to Booker, Washington on Union Street. But they got out early because of a teachers' meeting, so those kids decided to just walk on down to in front of the Capitol and get the bus and go. And the unusual part about it is that bus got down toward the square, it was more white people came on than usual. Claudette Colvin was not sitting in the first 10 seats that were always reserved for whites. She was sitting in the seat just before the back door. But when these white people came on and they asked her to get up, the bus driver, and he had authority under the city ordinance, and she concluded, she told him that I'm not sitting in the white section. I have a constitutional right to be here, and she wouldn't move. Claudette didn't know anything about me, but to make a long story short, E.D. Nixon, who was Mr. Civil Rights then in Montgomery, her pastor, Reverend Johnson of the Hutchinson Street Baptist Church, knew about E.D. Nixon, knew about this new lawyer in town, Fred Gray, and she ended up contacting, the preacher contacted Mr. Nixon contacted me. They retained me to represent Claudette. She was charged with being a delinquent. Judge Hill was a juvenile court judge in Montgomery at the time. And in my first civil rights case, I went and raised these little constitutional issues, and I told them that she's not a delinquent because she's an honest student. She was coming from school at that time. The judge was very nice. He received and listened to what I had to say, and politely found her to be a delinquent, and ordered that she be placed in the custody of her parents, and all she had to do was just stay out of trouble, and she'd have no more trouble. I knew if I was going to help Claudette, it was going to have to be in a federal court, because ultimately that's where they were. To make a long story short, the community weren't quite ready at that time, but then when Rosa Parks did what she did, and I'd known her since when I was in Alabama State, and the results was that we sat down, talked in my office, which was just a few blocks from where she was, or where she worked. And we talked about what a person should do if they decided that they wanted to not get up to give their seats. The bottom line is, we had to wait a little while. And sometimes we lawyers think these are our cases, but they're not our cases, it's the Khan's case. And I had that last meeting with Mrs. Parks on December 1st. I told her I had to go out of town, and she was going back to work. And when I got back, I ended up finding that Mrs. Parks had been arrested. She wanted me to come to her house. This was on a Thursday. Her case was set for the following Monday in the Recorder's Court of the City of Montgomery. And I raised my little constitutional issues again in that court. The court was very respectful. And the result was she was fined $10 in costs, which was $4. We decided, at least the community then decided, that they wanted to stay off of the buses. Plans were made, and you had the beginning of the bus boycott. We called it a protest. Plans were made, and the rest is history in terms of how the civil rights movement started. But what I had to look at every one of these cases that I have handled, whether it was cases that desegregated the buses, or whether it was a case of the gerrymandering in Gomillion versus Lightfoot, whether it was the Freedom Rides when John Lewis and others were beaten at the bus station in Montgomery, or whether it was when they were beaten back on Sunday, on Bloody Sunday in 1965, and before the close of day, the close of business on Monday, I filed a case of Roselle Williams, John Lewis, and Aurelia Boynton versus the governor of the state of Alabama. And then 4 days later, we had been able to get an order from a specially called court in New Orleans so that the march could take place and the Voting Rights Act ultimately was passed. Whether it was a case involving the desegregation of public schools, and when Governor Wallace decided, we had filed about 5 cases then to desegregate cases around 1962 and 63. But for some reason, he decided in Macon County that he would send the state troopers and stop it. And I had to go to work again. And before the close of day, the next day, I filed an amendment to my federal suit in which it asked that everything under the State Board of Education, instead of having to go case by system, and at that time we had about 119 school systems in Alabama. But in all of these cases, what I concluded was that it was in the best interest and that it would be acceptable with Christ. But what Judge Johnson did in those cases was designated the federal government as a party plaintiff. So it was not only me and the other lawyers who were representing these people, and I want you to know in all of these cases, Fred Gray was not the only lawyer. I had enough sense when they retained me to handle the bus boycott cases I'd heard about and read about Thurgood Marshall. I contacted him. He invited me to come to Washington. I went up there in December of 1955. He assigned Robert Carter to be his contact man, and from that time on, I had and I worked with the Legal Defense Fund and the NAACP. But in all of those cases, my first question is, what would Jesus want me to do? And as I look back now over 68 years of practice, I can't think of any case that I handled that I would not say that Jesus Christ was pleased with that particular case, because that's where it started. But one of the most fascinating, well, wasn't fascinating, but one of the real cases was the government had been being a party plaintiff in all these cases. I'm taking it now up to 1972. When I read in the Washington Post on the plane coming from Atlanta, coming from Washington to Atlanta, about these men in Tuskegee, Macon County, who the government had taken advantage of and had used as guinea pigs for 40 years. And even when syphilis became available, they failed to do it. And guess what? A couple of days afterwards, a man named Charlie Pollard walked into my office on the 27th of July, 1972. I had done some little work for him earlier, and he says, "Lawyer, I'm one of those men. I think the government took advantage of me. Will you think you can help me?" I told him I thought I could. That was my beginning of a relationship with the men in the infamous Tuskegee syphilis study. We were finally able to get as much money as we could out of the federal government. And in that case, unlike these other cases, I've been able to get the NAACP and the Legal Defense Fund to work with me. Jack Greenberg, who was then the director counsel, says, "This is a potentially fee-generating case, so we can't help you." So now, I'm representing them, don't have any assistance. I'm in Judge Johnson's court, and I know he's going to put me on a fast track. I tried to get these plaintiff law firms across the country to see if they wouldn't be willing to finance the case, and we shared the fee. Couldn't find anybody to do it. And then there was a man, a banker in Tuskegee, Allen Parker, at the Alabama Exchange Bank, who happens to be a member of the Church of Christ, which I was also, and we later desegregated those, the black church and the white church there, doing all of those. I went to him and said, "I need to borrow some money," and told him about the case. He says, "Well, lawyer, the bank will lend you some money, but we won't do it on a contingent fee basis. You're going to have to pay, well or not, but I can set up when the payment is due." To make a long story short, I had to borrow thousands of dollars in order to be able to represent those people, but we finally got it settled. Finally got an apology. Then those men told me, and all of them are dead now, they said, "We want you to do one other thing, and that is we want a permanent memorial in Tuskegee, Alabama, that will point out the fact that we made substantial contributions to the federal government, even though we didn't know we were doing it." I promised them, and that was over 26 years ago that I would try. Now, if I had been wise like most lawyers, once we got the money and once I got my little fee, I would have said, well, thank you, but I've done all I could do. But we started, and one of the best small museums in the country is the Tuskegee Human and Civil Rights Multicultural Center, located in Tuskegee, also known as the Tuskegee History Center. Not only is it a memorial to those men, but it is also, it gives a brief history of the contributions that Native Americans, Americans of European descent, and Americans of African descent have made to this country. The idea being, if you could see all of what has taken place and the problems that these three ethnic groups have done, then whatever our problems are now, and we have some serious problems still before us that we need to do. Then, of course, in addition, we'd already talked with you about the memorial for the men, but that museum also lists, and you can see the contribution African Americans have made to this country from slavery time in 1608 up until the present time, including 4 or 5 of those cases that residents of Macon County, Alabama, did. We ask you, if you think that Fred Gray has been able to do anything in helping to change the passion of this country and change the things that have taken place in it, then I ask you to help us keep the doors of that museum open so that we can continue to educate people. And there's some little information that'll tell you that you'll have exactly what you can do in order to do it. But you know, I'm going to mention one other thing, and I think I've used about all my time. I never dreamed, when I was talking about being a lawyer and filing these lawsuits and trying to get help, I never dreamed that I would be able to be speaking to a group including the Chief Justice of the Alabama Supreme Court. Never dreamed that I would be the 127th president of the Alabama Bar Association. And while I was a member of that bar, as told you earlier, we selected as an untitled lawyers render service. And that's what we do. Service to the client, service to the profession, and service to the community. That's our responsibility. And I'm glad that later on, while I used that as a theme, it was during Bill Clark's administration that he recommended that lawyers render service be made the theme. When they said, Bill, what's your theme going to be there? He said, I'm not going to have a theme. I'm going to ask the Board of Bar Commissioners to adopt the motto that Fred Gray had, and that is lawyers render service. But that was something else I did while I was president of Alabama State Bar. I became my bar year as president of the National Bar Association, the largest black organization of which I'll have to go and speak to. I recommended to them to establish the National Bar Association Lawyers Hall of Fame in 1983. I think it was 84. And they adopted it. And every year since that time, the National Bar Association had that. And it was Arthur Shores, the black lawyer who was my mentor, who I really wanted to see in it. And guess what? When I became the 127th president of the Alabama State Bar Association, I knew what I had done some 20 years before I recommended and appointed a task force for the purpose of establishing an Alabama Lawyers Hall of Fame. And guess what? They did it a year or so later, and every year after the first year, you now meet and you have law day, and it's all, I don't know anything about what anybody else may have had in mind, but when I presented it to the Board of Bar Commissioners and when I appointed the task force, all I wanted to do, I was just thinking about lawyers like Arthur Shores, and he was one of the first ones inducted. And also Judge Johnson was one in that event. So I am just delighted. And in each of those instances too, just as I had looked at these cases, and just as I was making the plans for my bar year, and I'm just so happy, I couldn't get everything of what I wanted in all those things, but sometimes what you do is get what, rather than to get nothing, you take what you can and you move along with it. I am just delighted that I look back over what I have tried to do with a lot of help, and some of that help has come from you. And all of these awards, I'm delighted that I have always been able to place Christ first in my life. And as I close, and as I was talking to John Lewis a week before he passed, his chief of staff, Mr. Collins, called me and he wanted to talk because he had wanted me to file a lawsuit so he could go to Troy State, but his parents said it would be too much pressure on them and he didn't do it. But he got involved in the movement too and still led the movement in helping so that people could get the right to vote. We, as lawyers, render service. Service to the client, service to the community, and a service to the profession. We are at a crucial point in the history of this country. The world is at a crucial point. And if we lawyers don't come up to the bat and actually enforce the Constitution and laws of this country, and it really, so far as I'm concerned, starts with Jesus Christ. But what John Lewis, when we finished after we had a prayer, and I said, Congressman, you've made such a tremendous contribution, probably been arrested as much as anybody for demonstrating. What would you want me to do? And he ended up telling me, brother, keep going, keep pushing, and keep the record straight. So I say to you lawyers who are rendering service, keep going, keep pushing, keep the record straight, do it in a non-violent manner, and do it until water runs down like justice and righteousness like a mighty stream. Thank you very much.